Absolute timeout. The absolute timeout command terminates the connection after the specified time period has elapsed, regardless of whether the connection is being used at the time of termination. You know that in exec timeout, if we have one idle session, okay, to console or line VTY or line IUX or auxiliary, the session will be terminated. But here in absolute timeout, it is not important that the session is idle or the session is, for example, using now. Because of that, actually, after the specified time in the absolute timeout in minutes, the session will be terminated. It is recommended to use the logout warning second command, and because of that, if you use this command before the absolute timeout minute, you will receive one warning message, line termination warning to users, and user understand that after a specified amount of time, the for example the timeout will be occur. The absolute timeout will be occur. You can use the command, this command, the logout warning command, along with the for example absolute timeout to notify users of an impending logout. Use the absolute timeout command line configuration command to configure the exec to terminate when the configured number of minutes occurs on the line. Let me to show you. In this scenario, as you can see, we have one switch, one router. I'm going to show you the function of the absolute timeout. It is so easy. For example, let me to configure absolute timeout for line VTY in the router. In the router, configure terminal line VTY 0 to 4 absolute timeout, for example 1 minute, okay? And after that, show running config can show us that under the line VTY 0 to 4 we have the command absolute timeout, okay? Here we have absolute timeout 1. Now let me to connect with telnet from the switch to the router. Look at here, from the switch I'm going to use telnet command, okay? And then the IP address of the router 10122. The password is Cisco, enable, and then Cisco. Now here, as you know, we have absolute timeout of 1 minute actually. What does it mean? It means that if you configure or if you don't configure after 1 minute, we will experience the timeout in session. Interface loopback 0, for example, IP address quad 1. I'm going to configure some features because I want to work actually. Interface loopback 1, IP address is 1.1.1.2.255.255.255, and then for example 255. Again, interface loopback 2. This is only for the activity, okay? As you can see, line timeout expired. And what does it mean? It means that the session after some second will be for example will be time out, okay? Let me to continue our configuration. Interface loopback 2, for example, IP address quad 2, and then quad, as you can see, connection closed, and again we can connect. If you want, you can change the for example logout warning time here. Let me to configure again in the router line console line VTY 0. Let me to configure logout, okay, under the line VTY 0 to 4. Let me to configure under the line VTY 0 to 4 logout, okay, warning, and then second. Here we can configure some second, for example 10 second means please 10 second or please 20 second before the logout give the for example message line termination, okay? For example 10 second here in this example. Look at here, again I'm trying to connect with telnet from switch to the router, telnet 10122 here, and then the user, the password, enable, Cisco. Let me to configure something, you know that we need to wait about 1 minute before the timeout. In 50 seconds after now, we will see the for example warning message. No interface loopback 0, you know that we have configured interface loopback 0, no interface loopback 1, no interface loopback 2, again interface for example loopback 10, IP address is quad 10, okay, quad 255, okay, and then here for example if you want, you can configure router EIGRP router ID quad 1, and after that for example network quad 10, okay, quad 0, and again, exit, again. Look at here, we received line timeout expired. After 10 seconds, you will see that the session will be terminated. Look at here, after some second, yes, connection to 10.122 closed by foreign host. In most cases, we use the absolute timeout in the VTY, but in some cases, in some iOS, you can configure it on the line console or on the line IUX0 to prevent users from indefinitely typing up valuable, for example, router VTY lines. You can implement absolute timers. Absolute timers differs from the inactivity timers. For example, I explained in the exec timeout video, because they will terminate a session whether it is active or not. Although absolute timers are rarely used, there are times when they can be quite useful. For example, in classroom and also lab situation, the absolute timeout can help to ensure that nobody uses more than their fair share of login time. Okay. 2. Prospect of having a session terminated in the middle of troubleshooting a problem in a production network is not appealing, okay, to most administrators. So if you do choose to implement an absolute timer, we can say it is recommended setting the timer to a reasonable amount of time, no less than 10 minutes. And also in addition, you should enable a logout warning to ensure that the user has plenty of notice to save their work. And finally, let me to emphasize that in most cases we don't use absolute timeout and we use exec timeout. For example, it is recommended that you configure exec timeout, for example, with a lower amount of time, 2 minutes, and then absolute timeout with a higher amount of time, for example, 10 minutes. What does it mean? If we have 2 minutes of inactivity, okay, the session should be terminated. And if we have 10 minutes of activity or inactivity, the session will be terminated. But in most cases, we don't use the absolute timeout.